Good evening, everyone. I hope you all can hear me okay. My name is Amanda Thomas, and I will be your Mistress of Ceremonies this evening, and I would love to welcome you to a special Science on Tap online. This is the second time we've done this, and tonight we will be talking about oxytocin, the science behind the most sensationalized hormone, with Dr. Randi Hutter Epstein, who is a lecturer at Yale University and the author of a fabulous book called Aroused: The History of Hormones and How They Control Just About Everything. And Randi came out in the summer of 2018 to give a talk on this book. It was a lot of fun. And you can actually hear her talk about this if you go to our podcast, which you may or may not know that we have a podcast. It's called A Scientist Walks Into a Bar. And I believe those of you on chat, our various chat moderators will be posting a link to that here shortly. But you can hear her talk if you go to episode 20 and check that out. And I I was very amused because I sent an email out to a handful of former Science on Tap speakers who had done our events in the past to ask them if they would be interested in helping us with this online series. And I think it was maybe about 5.5 minutes later that Randi called me and said, "Yes, I'm in. I'm going to do it." So anyway, sorry, I have a cat crawling across my desk. She's not very helpful. She thinks she is. Sorry about that. It's joys of doing events from home. So there may be some of you who have not been to one of our Science on Tap events before and wanted to give you just a brief information about what we do. We run monthly Science on Tap events in Portland, Oregon, and Vancouver, Washington, and we've been doing that for about 7 years. And our goal is to make science accessible to adults primarily, although we realize that there may be some kids in the audience, though tonight's topic, who knows? It's going to be very sciencey, don't worry. Our events are casual, and we like to encourage people to be comfortable and have a beverage of their choice, sometimes alcoholic, beer or wine or whatever, or non-alcoholic, whichever you prefer. So we encourage you to partake in a beverage of your choice if you wish. And we will be doing more online events. We have another one coming up next week on bird watching with an expert from Audubon. And because we figure people are looking out their windows these days, so figure it would be fun to tell them what they're looking at. And we will be recording this event and posting it online on Facebook and YouTube, hopefully tomorrow or Saturday. So if you want to see parts of this again or send the link to friends, you are welcome to do that. So here's what you can expect for tonight. And for those of you who attend our events in person, I want to apologize. We're not doing trivia tonight. We usually do, but it's a little awkward to do it remotely like this. We did have somebody who suggested a way to do trivia after last week's event. We have not had a chance to review it yet, so hopefully we will. But we're not going to do that tonight. I will be introducing Randi here in just a moment, and she will speak for 45 minutes to an hour or so. We'll be finished somewhere around 8 p.m. And then there's time for questions afterward. And you can submit questions through the Facebook or Zoom chat. There are moderators there who will be fielding the questions and will be sending them to me, and I will read them to Randi at the end of the event. I do want to mention that Randi, while she is a doctor and is incredibly smart, she is not a clinician. So please don't, if you have any specific questions about oxytocin in your own personal life, please refrain from oversharing. So just going to put that out there. And like I said, we'll be finished around 8:15 or so. And then Randi is going to stick around in the text chat for a little while afterwards. So if you have questions that you didn't get answered during the Q&A and you would like to have her answer, you're welcome to do that. She'll be there for a little while. And then afterwards, we will be sending out a survey to you folks because we want to know how we can do this better and improve and because we hope to be doing this for a little while. And One more thing before we get started. We need your support to be able to continue doing this. And we realize that there are a lot of people in financial trouble right now, and we don't want to take anything away from anybody. But if you do have an opportunity to support us, we would greatly appreciate that. These programs aren't going to happen without that. So there's two ways that you can do that. You can go to Patreon and search for Make You Think. Make You Think is our partner nonprofit organization. Or you can do a one-time donation to makeyoutthink.org/support. And we will put these links in the chats and various places as well. But just wanted to mention that real briefly. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and welcome Randi to the stage and toast you with my glass. And are you on there? Can you?
I'm holding my drink. Can you hear me?
Okay, so take it away.
Great. I was so excited to hear from you that I didn't even email you back. When I got Amanda's email, I picked up the phone and called her because Science on Tap is my most fun all-time place to be, because really, what is more fun than a really good bar? I mean, we don't have in real life, I guess this is real life, in person, they've got this really great bar in the back of their auditorium, and you can sort of listen and get yourself another drink and sit back down. So I invite all of you out there in Zoom land to do the same thing tonight. If you are going to get up and get yourself a drink during my talk, if you have a laptop, I'm hoping that you'll carry the laptop with you so that you don't miss anything, and then just carry it back with your drink in one hand and the laptop in the other. I've got what I told people is my quarantini. It's a gin martini, and I think I said for those of you on social media that we're connecting that I would tell you what I do. The key thing before we get to the oxytocin is a good martini shaker, and I'm into shaking it, not the stir thing. Very cold, good glass, good vermouth is key, just a splash in and out, and then of course an olive, and I've got one here with feta in it here. There it is. I just won't drip it on my computer. So yeah, thanks for the introduction, Amanda. I'm an MD, not a clinician. I'm a medical writer and teacher. And I've written this book that Amanda told you about, Arouse, the history of hormones and how they control just about everything. And often people will say to me, you know, well, what's your favorite hormone? And I really don't like to choose favorites. But now that we've been all social distancing, and if I had to choose one, I do think I would choose oxytocin as my favorite hormone, because at some point we're going to be re-socializing and undistancing. And I thought, what better thing to talk about while we're apart is the hormone that has been touted to put people together and to bond. So I just want to make one thing clear. Oxytocin is a brain hormone. It comes from near your pituitary gland. We'll get to that in a minute, but I don't want you to confuse it with oxycodone. That's a narcotic. So this talk is going to be an oxytocin talk, the brain hormone. A few things to know about it, and let's see if I can share. I don't have a pointer, but the human side is me, if you can tell the difference. The human side is my daughter Martha and me, and the hairier side is what I felt like when I was nursing, so I just felt this bond with the little monkey. The reason why I'm putting it on is because oxytocin, what we've known for a long time, is it's the hormone that spikes during labor. It prompts your womb to contract. It gets the baby out. Afterwards, it triggers the breast ducts to squeeze out milk. If you've ever given birth or ever watched one and a doctor said, oh, let's just give her a shot of blah, 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 and that'll move things along. The blah, blah, blah that he was talking about, he said Pitocin, and Pitocin is the synthetic form of oxytocin. So your doctor is just giving you oxytocin. And now you're thinking, wait, I didn't sign up to hear about childbirth and breastfeeding. Because we're not. Because recent research has rebranded this heady substance of oxytocin into something much more marketable to a larger audience than its first initial matronly connotations. Oxytocin has been shown to do the following: foster bonds between mothers and newborns, foster bonds between lovers. It's been shown to bring on erections and orgasms and enhance mind reading. I'm not sure with the erections and orgasms and mind reading if that all just pours on at the same time when your oxytocin rises, or in what particular order. Oxytocin has also been linked to trust and empathy. A small study showed that it increased empathy between Israelis and Palestinians. I did a little Google search recently to catch up, and I found that there's a chapter in a scholarly book called Political Rallies, Radicalization, and Oxytocin. Among the flood of studies of oxytocin and behavior in the last decade, and in my book, when I did a search, I say that there were 3,500 oxytocin behavior studies. I just did another really quick Google Scholar search, and I plugged in oxytocin and behavior, and it said there were 28,700 studies. Somehow I don't think that there were thousands of more in just 2 years. But let's just say that somewhere between 3,500 and some ginormous boatload of oxytocin behavior studies, this hormone has been linked to trust, but also distrust, love, but also envy, empathy, but also racism. So then, what's a potential oxytocin buyer to do? And that's when I started to dig in. I wanted to know, what's the history of this? How do we discover this? And how do we come up with all these studies? I wanted to find out who these real heroes were in science. Who were the people asking all those cool questions? Because one of the things I always tell my students is, you know, we tend to think that the scientists are the ones that know how to answer the questions correctly. And that is a good thing to do, to answer questions correctly. But the really, really genius scientists ask the most brilliant questions. They know what questions to ask. So those are the scientists I was looking for. And then, of course, the hucksters, because they make up a good story. And I also kind of feel like by the end of this evening, I would like for all of you out there to be able to have a feel when it comes to oxytocin of what's the silly stuff and what's the real stuff. So I thought I'd start with the hucksters and go back in time in history a little. And I can't see anybody, but for those of you from Los Angeles or living there now, I thought you could just raise a glass or maybe like hit a button on chat. And I just want to say, for full disclosure in this talk, I'm a judgmental New Yorker. So when I set out to do my research to find where would be the wackiest place doing kind of wacky stuff with oxytocin, I thought, well, Los Angeles, of course. So sorry if I offended anyone out there in Zoom land. But anyhow, my husband happened to be going on a business trip to LA, and I said, I'm going to go. I'm going to do my chapter. I'm going to find my huckster there. And he said something like, oh, you're such a judgmental New Yorker, which I already just said I was. And anyhow, even if there were a place in LA, you don't even know LA. There's so much traffic, and it's huge. It could be 2 hours from where we're staying, or it could be probably really close, but if you're sitting in traffic, it would take 2 hours, because that's what I kind of think. But anyhow, wait, I just think I went off my share mode. Hold on with me a second. Let's see, I'm gonna share my screen again. And there we go. That's what I think of when it's kind of a little old version of LA, but there we did. We actually flew. We didn't drive across, but that sort of reminds me of sort of what I did. I did go to LA, and when we got to our hotel and I did a little research, turns out that the clinic, the oxytocin hormone place that I was looking for was right across the street, like literally just right across the street from our hotel. So why am I telling you this long-winded story of how I got there? Because I won that argument, and I just think that, I don't know, it just, my dopamine must have skyrocketed. I think my oxytocin skyrocketed. I was so happy just to say to my husband, I told you so. So that's where I went to the Hall Clinic, the Hall Center on Wilshire Boulevard. And I met Dr. Prudence Hall, who is an OBGYN, but gave up her practice at UCLA to open this hormone clinic. And when I got there, it was exactly what I expected from an alternative place doling out hormones in LA. There was teak furniture. I mean, I just want you to imagine this with me also a moment. It had saffron colored walls, cozy couches, nature images, and the whole place smelled like those like green, healthy juices. I realized after when I left that actually the Hall Clinic is on top of a green, healthy juice place, so I think they just get the fumes, but it definitely added to the whole vibe. When you go to meet the doctor, you walk through a little shop where you can see things like all of her Hall's own line of body software, it's called. There was a pink bottle that was called Secret of Pink Feminine Radiance. The green bottle was called Prostate Protect. But I was there to learn about oxytocin. So Dr. Hall, her publicist, and we each gathered together, and she gave us her own brand of oxytocin, which is sublingual. It goes under your tongue. And she said that gives you the greatest boost of oxytocin. And we all got closer because you could do that in those days. We unsocial distanced and we're sucking on this candy, and it tasted quite like sugar. And we all leaned in, and Dr. Hall said, "Do you feel it?" "I'm feeling it." And her publicist said, "I'm feeling it." And we all started to do this group hormone hug, I guess. But I didn't feel anything. Hall told me that she gives these oxytocin, I don't want to call them candies, I guess her things, to her clients or her patients who get the social jitters before parties, who lost their sex drive, who just don't feel like their old friendly selves again. And Hall isn't alone. I mean, I found even New York has crazy places like this. And I found there was loads of oxytocin out there being sold as nasal sprays and perfumes and being told, pour it on you. And when you go to a bar, that person next to you is just going to want to be with you. You're going to feel good about yourself, and they're going to feel good about yourself too. So this all got me, it was funny but angry at the same time, because you kind of feel like, what's going on here? Are these people taking something dangerous? Are they just paying for air? And I know that you didn't click in tonight just to hear about the silly stuff going on, because there's so much of that anyhow. You want to hear some of the real stuff, and that's where some of the real fun stuff is in the history and who did what first. So I'll try to share a screen again, and let's see if this works. We'll say goodbye to LA. And if we go back in time, I would say the first bit of information about oxytocin came in 1906. And it has to do with the study of a cat, not that cat, that's my next door neighbor's cat. This was a cat that was around in 1906, and the pituitary gland. And it was a young British scientist, his name is Henry Dale. He would go on to get the Nobel Prize, not for this, but for other stuff he did. But at the time, he was doing some studies with ergot, which is a fungus. And for whatever reason, it wasn't what he was told to be doing, but there was a lot of research in the pituitary gland in those days. And I'll just explain, the pituitary gland controls a lot of hormones. We weren't quite sure what it did back in 1906. But if everyone out there right now, just to explain a little bit, could put their finger here in the middle of your eyes, And if you were to shove your finger all the way back in your head, please don't do this. But if you were to just get your finger in there and shove it back in your head, you would be touching your pituitary gland. I just want to repeat, don't actually do that. You can even just more easily look at that picture on my PowerPoint, and it shows you in a safer way where the pituitary gland is. Henry Dale, for whatever reason, he didn't say, he took a chunk of the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. It kind of looks like, it dangles like an upside down lollipop from your brain. You can kind of see there. It's 2 lobes, which you don't see there, but there are 2 lobes. He took the posterior lobe. He gave it to a pregnant cat, and its womb squeezed. And he said, oh, there must have been, he wrote that, he actually tucked that one sentence in a much longer scientific article. And then it was forgotten about. And we didn't really think much about oxytocin until the 1940s, when his research was rediscovered and we started realizing that, oh, here's a hormone that squeezes the uterus and it also triggers milk. And by 1953, it was synthesized, named oxytocin, because that means swift birth. But here's where all the behavior stuff starts coming in. Around the same time in the 50s, there was a lot of research going on with mother-baby bonding. I guess it was the 50s, the women were home, that was all they were allowed to do, was stay home, make babies, and bond with them. And so somehow this oxytocin research, I wouldn't say it merged with the mother-baby bonding, but it definitely overlapped. This is going to bring me to one of my favorite scientists, who's still an energetic professor at Duke University today. But I'm going to go back to when Dr. Peter Klopfer was just starting out. And he was a graduate student at Yale University. And he was interested in figuring out what went on in those moments of birth between animals and their babies that made them bond, that led to nurturing. And he thought, well, maybe it has to do with a hormone that spikes suddenly at birth. So he knew about the oxytocin stuff, and he wanted to figure out ways of perhaps separating babies, not human babies. He was working with goats and their kid babies. He wanted to separate them and see if that prevented bonding, which it did, and then see what was going on in their brains, what hormones were going on that had something to do with the mother-baby bonding. So he did his studies at first at a farm outside New Haven, but that meant if he needed to take the babies away right at birth or see what happens right at labor, and he didn't know when these goats were going to be giving birth, he would have to sleep at the barn, which he did a few nights, and then he got sick of sleeping at the barn. So he thought, you know what? He was living in New Haven. He had sublet this home of a professor that was in Europe. And he thought, who's going to know? He put some bedding down in the living room and turned this guy's living room into a little barn and brought all the pregnant goats in there. And that way he could just go to sleep on a bed or kind of near the goats, and he wouldn't have to be sleeping in the barn. The goats would come to him, instead of vice versa. The good news is he did some great research. He did great studies. The bad news part was that this professor, these were in the days where you couldn't just email or send a quick note and say, hey, I'm arriving back soon. But the professor came home early, found out that his home was turned into a barn, wasn't very happy. So that ended the New Haven studies for Dr. Klopfer, but he did get a professorship at Duke and went there and got his own home that had land for his animals. Where to this day, he's still doing research on his farmland in his home right near Duke. And then we go on from there, and I'll just share my screen again. And here we went from cats to goats. It's not a great photograph, but I'll just keep it up for a second. And that's from Dr. Klopfer's, one of his first studies, showing this mom who was prevented from her kid at first would just headbutt him. So without the oxytocin, new mothers will just treat their newborn babies as foreigners. After his research, further studies showed, looking in rats and mice, that if you injected oxytocin into a virgin rat, that rat that had never had babies, that normally hated having babies around, would start cuddling babies, even try to nurse them. And the other way, if you blocked oxytocin in a rat that had just given birth, it would treat, or a goat, it would treat their offspring like foreigners, which also meant that a lot of times they would just whack them away, like they didn't want them around. So where did this go from here? Peter Klopper was down at Duke, and there was a graduate of Duke University trying to make money. And he was painting Peter's house, and they got chatting about research and oxytocin and behavior. And this kid who had just graduated wasn't sure what he was going to do, and got interested chatting with Peter, and thought, wow, this is interesting stuff, but how does that work? Like what he was saying, how do we know that oxytocin, what makes oxytocin spike right after birth? What happens in the human body, or what happens in an animal body that's different from anything else? So this student, Court Peterson, thought, the one thing that happens, and if you think about what's going on with your body, any woman out there that's given birth and someone says, what did your body do during birth that it's never done before, is what happens. Your vagina expands larger than it ever has been. So Court Peterson thought, what if I make a balloon contraption that expands a goat's vagina and see if it makes the oxytocin spike? And sure enough, it did. His little experiment was then confirmed with others. And we saw that actually this process of birth gets your oxytocin spiking, creates these mother-baby bonds, gets the baby out, gets the milk coming out. And this really was the beginning, the beginnings of looking at, wow, here's a hormone that's actually controlling a behavior. These animals that then were given oxytocin, they would try to nurse even if it weren't their babies. So we're seeing these strong emotional ties from this brain hormone. It led to decades of research. And I'm not going to go through all of them. I have a bunch of them in my book, but I'll just tell you, in 1987, when we moved into human studies, Stanford scientists recruited 12 women and 8 men to masturbate while they were taking blood samples. I don't have a screenshot of this, but you can just try to picture it in your head. They did find out that oxytocin spiked right at the moment of orgasm. It was hard to conclude whether the oxytocin brought on the orgasm or vice versa, but yet again, it was this more stuff of oxytocin and behavior. And then getting into the 21st century, we started to think, well, okay, what does bonding mean? Bonding might mean trusting. So should we study oxytocin and trust? Is there something about these bonds that mean you trust someone? So there was this small study done that used a group of students, fake money. It was one of those game studies with fake money and students. And somehow they found that the students that were sniffing oxytocin were more likely to fork over their fake money in this fake investor game. The impact of this study was stunning. It just led to a ton of publicity about mother bonding, about trust, and it led to, well, a whole new way of looking at oxytocin. Well, no, it didn't actually lead to that show, but it did lead to all kinds of weird stuff going on about what oxytocin could do. And there were a lot of people thinking, well, if there's some interesting science going on, and these studies were providing wonderful clues, but it went from clues to a market really quickly. So in my book, I wrote that you can go on Amazon. I don't recommend doing this. And I wrote that you can buy oxytocin for $48. But actually, I went on Amazon recently and prices have come down. I'm gonna have to listen. Let's see. No, you don't want the Love Boat again. This is what I found. Oxy Love. And now it's only $32. One spray, 2 hours before desired effect. And here's what this Oxy Love is touted to do. And this I'm just reading right from the Amazon, from their packaging. It says that oxytocin has been scientifically proven by the medical field to reduce social fears, anxiety, stress, and create feelings of trust between others. Each spray, it said, contains the real oxytocin, not just oxytocin accelerators as in other brands. It also said when you take this one spray 2 hours before the desired effect, you will have all of this: better sex life, reduced stress, more energy, more focus, decreased anxiety, increased orgasm, and improved sleep. And I think that's probably all at the same time. No unnatural preservatives, and keep refrigerated. So what's the real deal? Because there are these real studies going on, and then you see this wacky stuff online. And whenever you see wacky stuff, it doesn't just come out of nowhere. There's always a grain of truth. There's always these seeds of really cool science that someone just sort of leapt too far. They're seeing a market way too soon before there should be one. This thanks to researchers who are doing really interesting stuff, and they still are today. We think that oxytocin augments emotions coming into the brain. We think it may be involved in love and trust and sex and decreasing anxiety, but it seems to cement or augment incoming signals. We haven't figured out a way to use it as a treatment yet. Here's what we know. We know that oxytocin comes from the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus, and that's right above your pituitary gland. And I got this nice little image from doctors who have done oxytocin research, Pranja Mehta and Eric Knight, who are now both at University College London. But one of the things that I like to say, I knew how to tell people how to find their pituitary gland, but oxytocin researcher, a real leading oxytocin researcher, Dr. Bianca Marlin Jones, and I asked her if I could use the same thing, because I thought it was a good way to say, if you want to know where your oxytocin is made in your brain, you can put one finger on an ear, one on your nose, and if you think, again, don't really try to do this, but if one finger went back in your head and the other back in your ear, where your fingers would meet, that's where your oxytocin comes from. So I went to Dr. Jones's lab when she was at NYU before. Now she has her own lab at Columbia. And I got to see what she and Dr. Robert Fromke are doing with mice and what they're doing. And it does, I think, give wonderful insights into what oxytocin possibly is doing in the human brain. They have figured out a way to light up, or they've looked for receptors of oxytocin. So that's the part of your brain that receives the signals. It comes out of the hypothalamus, but there's parts of your brain that receive these signals. They found that the parts of the brain that receive a lot of oxytocin signals is in the left temporal lobe, which is a fascinating thing because for years people have thought is there something about the sounds of babies? When Dr. Jones and these other researchers were looking at the mother-baby bonds in rodents, they thought, is there something about these little baby mice when they're crying that lures the mother to help them? Probably you could say the same for humans too. And they think now that when the babies are crying, that is received in the temporal lobe where you get a lot of your hearing, and it lights up all these oxytocin receptors, and that's what makes this urge for these mothers to bond with their babies. They've done studies where they've blocked the oxytocin, and when these crying little pups want their moms, the moms do not come to get them. They've also done studies, and they've been able to release the oxytocin by lighting up with a laser. They actually light up those receptors, and it gets the oxytocin coming out. They've lit up the oxytocin and triggered it to start going in the mice brains. And if they take a virgin mouse that normally wouldn't cuddle a newborn baby, and they light up the oxytocin, that mouse will start cuddling the little mouse baby, even try to nurse it. So what does this mean? These little mice studies of watching them run after their babies or not run after their babies. It means that we think that oxytocin is stimulated by external stimuli, whether it's sight or feel, and in this case, sound. But it's not necessarily what they found creating the mother-baby bond, but augmenting lurking feelings that you have. And it's interesting because they also think that there's always been stories, and I know someone that this happened to, a woman who was so yearning to have a baby. And when she would hear the cries of her neighbor's newborn, this woman who didn't have a baby yet actually started lactating. I wouldn't have believed it if I didn't know the woman, but now we think that can be through your oxytocin receptors, that she wanted this so badly, and the sound of the baby was hitting her oxytocin so much. It not only created this bond that she wanted, but also the lactation effect. It also means that it augments feelings. It could be that if you're in an airplane and you're not yearning for a baby on that airplane with you, and you hear that baby crying, that same input could just augment you to be that much more annoyed. So again, it goes back to those studies saying, how can one hormone be jealousy and trust and distrust and envy and bonding and not bonding? How can we get this all in one hormone? Because it's not that the hormone is forcing the bonding or forcing something on you. It's augmenting a behavior that might be lurking in you. What are we doing these days with it? We're still doing interesting brain research, mostly on animals. There's been a few human studies. We know that it's something to do with social skills. There's been attempts looking at using oxytocin on children with autism. So far, it's conflicting results. It might be the method of delivering it. Remember, the hormone has to get to your brain. We're not sure when you're inhaling these substances how much is actually going. So where are we now, though? Well, I can tell you that Dr. Peterson, I'm saying doctor, so you know he's no longer a house painter. That guy that I told you about, the balloon vagina guy that was like, oh, this happens at birth, and that's what made the oxytocin skyrocket. He got so interested in science, he went on to medical school, became a leading oxytocin expert, and he is now a professor of psychiatry and neurobiology at the University of California, University of North Carolina. I'll repeat that, Dr. Peterson is at the University of North Carolina. Bianca Jones, I've told you, was at NYU, and now she has her own lab where she's looking at other of oxytocin and bonding and looking right into the mouse brains. And she's also looking at childhood trauma and looking at inherited trauma and those hormone effects. Prentice Hall, who got me into this whole route back in LA. Well, turns out that she was calling herself an endocrinologist, and she missed a few cancers, and she's now being sued. and her license is under dispute. She cannot call herself an endocrinologist anymore because turns out if you didn't go for your boards and spend 3 years on the wards and learning all about hormones and pass a test, you just can't say you're an endocrinologist. You actually have to be board certified. But I want to end with this reminder, and I would like to open it up. I guess we can open it up to questions soon. I have a few more stories that I'd like to share, but we are learning so much about oxytocin from mice. I think they give fascinating clues. I do believe that oxytocin is a crucial hormone with social skills and with bonding, perhaps with love life, and perhaps with trust, and perhaps with distrust, but we're not quite there yet for the treatments. I like to tell people that rather than spend your money, whether it's $32 or $48 or $5 on some oxytocin spray, you might just want to, I don't know, meet someone and get a drink or go to Science on Tap when we can get back in that auditorium and talk to the person next to you. And I'll just, let's see if I can share one more time. That's your hypothalamus, and I'll go right to the next one. And here's an example, I guess, to make a personal story of what made my oxytocin skyrocket. These are my 4 children. So I think maybe for me, just looking at them now is probably having some effect on my bonding and my oxytocin skyrocket, what definitely did during birth, during nursing. And who knows? I think, though, that when it comes to hormones and behavior, this is sort of the future of where we are in endocrinology now. It's not the future, it's right now. We're looking at other hormones and their effect on behavior. We are at this wonderful time where we can do brain imaging and studies, and really important studies of hormones and behavior, not just with oxytocin, but we're looking at behavior of hunger hormones and appetite hormones. And I feel like when we get, our next step is not going to be what does oxytocin do itself and what can we use with this sole treatment. It'll probably be very personalized. One of the things that we're learning as we go on in the future to see into the brains is that each hormone, we tend to think of hormones in silos. That, okay, are you deficient in oxytocin, or could you use a little more? Are you deficient in growth hormone, or could use a little more? But one of the things you have to realize is all these hormones are interconnected. They're not like silos. It's more like, well, it's like this. It's my hands all connected together, and it's all this jumble. And when you give one hormone, it's probably going to affect another. So everything has to be done, as I say, under the advice of an endocrinologist that comes out of serious scientific studies. And also, the future is not going to be something that you can tap on some website and buy a pill. It's going to be different for each person. We know that already. We know that for women on the birth control pills, some women take it easily, and other women it makes them feel depressed, and some women might be at increased risk for stroke. It's going to be the same with oxytocin, that some women have trouble nursing. Maybe that has something to do with it. Some women don't. And I think it's going to be not just about the level of your hormone, but the sensitivity of your receptors, how many receptors you have. And I guess it's like anything else, the more we dig in for the real research, the more we don't jump and try to make conclusions, the more complex the field is. But in some ways, that's what makes it so much more exciting. So I like to begin with the story of the hucksters, because I think, okay, well, that's silly. We can buy oxytocin or we can visit this lab. But the really fun stuff, the really good stories, I think, are when we go back in time and see what people have done in the beginning and what they're doing now and what they're trying to do with the sophisticated medical technology. So I think I've rambled on for a long time. And maybe what we can do, I'd like to just because I like to do this, I'm just going to share my screen one more time and show my oxytocin boosters. Those are 4 of my oxytocin boosters. They're not mice, they're little humans. And maybe I can turn it over to Amanda. You'll do the Q and I'll try to do the A, if that's okay.
So thank you, Randy. It was fascinating. I was chatting with some of the folks, and the balloon vagina guy got a quote that was an interesting um, uh, way to describe him. Anyway, have a lot of questions about levels of oxytocin and how just you mentioned at the end how one of the ways that we could improve our oxytocin in the future would be to, go to Science on Tap and have a drink with somebody. And we live in a state where cannabis is legal, and there's a question about if there's any known connection between cannabis and oxytocin.
Not that I know of. And I also think, right now, part of the issues with these studies that say it boosts this is that when we do these mice studies, and I don't know if mice are, smoking a lot of weed in Oregon these days, but when we're doing the mice studies, we're looking at oxytocin in the brain. They're going deep in, and when they give oxytocin, they're actually putting it into the brain of the mice. So I think part of the problem with some of the studies is that you can't just draw someone's blood and say, okay, this is what we found of oxytocin levels in your body. It might not really depict what's going on in the brain. So right now, I think we're just really in the beginning of this research, and we're not there yet to even say what levels and what's going on. We're doing imaging studies to say, oh, this lights up that area that the oxytocin receptors are in. Like that bottle of Oxy Love that was called, that it said each one contains 2 IUs of oxytocin, must be taken between 2 hours. I think anything out there that is so definite about oxytocin is a red flag that there's something wacky about it. We just don't have that yet.
Is there any kind of indication what is in that OxyLove or those other things, or is it just sort of smoke and mirrors?
Well, the wonderful thing about our country is that if you don't call yourself a drug, and there's nothing on there that says a drug, it has a picture of like octagons attached. So I'm assuming that's supposed to be the oxytocin chemical it's showing. You're not really supposed to say that. You're not really supposed to promote things without having the real evidence. I'm not sure how that got away with it, but it's considered a supplement, not a drug. So yeah, I have no idea what's in those things. I'm assuming some of these are water. I don't know, but it didn't go through FDA testing. It's not a drug, so we don't know what the dose is or what's in it at all.
That's slightly worrying.
I think I think the thing that I had that I put under my tongue that did nothing, I think it was an after dinner mint. Sometimes they make you feel better, but yeah.
Right. Speaking as somebody else asked this, so it's not just me asking this myself, but speaking as somebody who doesn't have kids myself, I do have pets, and who, for example, the one who climbed across my desk earlier. Is there any kind of research or anything on human animal bonding in a pet kind of situation?
Well, I'm a dog lover. I mean, I wouldn't have an oxytocin spike from a cat, no offense, but I would from a dog. No, but the one thing that I forgot to mention, but it probably just makes sense that you're all thinking about, is that these mice and rat studies give wonderful clues about how the human brain works. But I like to think that many of us have more complicated brains. So for instance, with these mice studies, if you take a mouse or a rat and you remove their child right at the time they gave birth and they miss that oxytocin spike, they will not bond with their baby. That doesn't happen with humans. We know you can adopt children. You can bond with kids that didn't come out of you. So humans are much more complicated. And I think that should be like one of the big takeaways when we look at other studies of trust or distrust or what oxytocin does, to realize that we're so much more complicated than these mice and these goats and their kids. And I think the proof is that even without that birth of oxytocin, we can have, get babies, you adopt a baby, and the minute they're put in your arms, you probably do get that oxytocin spike, but you didn't need it from the actual giving birth. So, and that's part of the thing that we know, that seeing something. So yeah, going off that, are there studies to prove this? Not that I know of, that people have done human animal bonding, but I would think that the way sounds of something, and we talked about oxytocin augmenting feelings. So I think, yes, this bond that you can have with your pets, that yes, I think that would affect it, because that incoming signal, the same as maybe the oxytocin, if you have a big fear of pets, it might skyrocket your oxytocin to then augment that fear and distrust of an animal.
Interesting. There was another question earlier asking, related to what you were just talking about, whether people who give birth vaginally versus through cesarean section, if there's any kind of difference.
No, and that's what I like to point out. I mean, and again, it's because humans are much more complicated. I think maybe it would have made a difference in the goat or the rat, but we have so much more going on in terms of bonding and cognitive processing and other hormones. And I do think that, you have a baby by C-section, it didn't go through labor the way it did in those animal studies that gave us clues. But the minute, women who give birth by C-section are nursing and they're bonding. And there have been studies on, for instance, on breastfeeding moms. And again, this isn't a pro or anti-breastfeeding, but just in terms of oxytocin. And I would think also, getting away from breastfeeding, a mom who just had a baby and putting that baby up to their chest, they think that the spike in oxytocin also is this like really calming effect. And there are women that will say, as they nurse, that spike of oxytocin just brings on this calming feeling.
There have been a couple of questions about people who have a lack of oxytocin, perhaps. Does that lead to narcissism, or what was it? People with commitment issues? Is there any kind of evidence around that?
Not yet. We're so far from that, and we wouldn't know how to measure it. And and then you'd probably have to like cut their brain open. Maybe you'd want to actually, if somebody is that commitment freaked out or narcissistic, you probably do want to cut their brain open and see what is going on in their hypothalamus. And if you did, remember from the talk, you want to aim for this area, like if this finger and this finger meet in the middle. We don't know enough about levels, and and there have been in the past, not with oxytocin, but other things in the past where people have had, not all, but there's stories of people with like deviant behavior or criminals, and then they'll find out that they had a brain tumor lodged in a certain part of their brain. It's very difficult to always prove cause and effect. So I think as humans, we're always looking for this biological reasoning, and that's what drives a lot of this research, but there's still so much that we don't know yet.
Speaking of some of the research, you mentioned, I think at the near the beginning, about how there were some unexpected study results related to, or associating, racism and distrust and things like that with oxytocin. And can you talk about that a little bit more? Because that really surprised me and a couple of our listeners.
I think the point of these studies was just to show that what we think now is that we think that oxytocin is not the love bonding hormone. It's a hormone that augments your feelings. So, and I think the point of some of these studies was to say, there's learned behavior, and then you might get this surge of oxytocin that cements that learned behavior. You can't take somebody who maybe is distrustful or maybe racist or whatever and say, okay, we're going to give them more oxytocin, or we're going to put this oxytocin fog around them, and we're going to change their mind about things. So I think that's what really the new research has been showing, coming out of these labs in New York and Emory, is how oxytocin seems to just solidify some of these lurking feelings.
That is really fascinating. There's a question about how oxytocin interacts with some of the other neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin and that sort of thing? Is there any way to tease those out? How do they interact with each other?
We're just starting to look at that now. And again, the way I like to think about it is that we know all of these things do interact. And again, and dopamine's another one, that's the one that we say, oh, we have a surge of dopamine when we're happy. But again, we're not always measuring your brain levels, and we don't always know for sure at certain points. We know from hints that people that have Parkinson's, that ruin that can lead to problems with their dopamine, that there's depression related. Same as serotonin, the serotonin, that's where some of our first antidepressants came from. So we have hints from when things have gone wrong. How they exactly all interact with each other, do they? Absolutely, they probably do. And that's another reason why I think it's never going to be as simple as just take this or take that. You take one thing, it might throw something else off balance, or it might enhance it.
Speaking of throwing things off balance, is there any work being done around drug abuse and oxytocin? I know my first question was about cannabis, but I'm talking more about drugs of abuse where people are chronically addicted.
I think there have, and a lot of these new behavior studies in humans are still having conflicting advice. The most exciting area that had been exciting, there is some with addiction, but what was getting a lot of press and what people were excited about was oxytocin and autism. Children that have trouble bonding but want to bond, would oxytocin help them? And it's just been conflicting. I think there's been some people saying maybe, but it hasn't worked as well as we think. But those studies are still going on. And it could mean that with some cases of addiction or with children with autism, if we learn what dose or how to give it, I'm still optimistic, but we're not there yet.
This seems particularly relevant for these times, that I know that heightened levels of stress can make cortisol levels in your body spike and cause physical problems as a result of that ongoing stress. Is there any evidence around that and oxytocin?
You mean too high levels?
Yeah. What happens when you are stressed for a long time?
Well, a lot of the stress work, and especially the chronic stress, is looking at chronically high cortisone levels, and that's your stress hormone. But again, as I feel like I keep complicating every story, there's other hormones that are related to stress in your body. And I think what we have to think about is all these hormones go up and down. And that's why some of these studies get complicated, because they'll say we took a blood level, but that just gives a snapshot. It doesn't often tell what's going on the whole day. And we do know that chronic stress is throwing things out of whack, and we're just learning now. And it's because we're not letting the ebb and flow of hormones. How oxytocin plays into that, I don't think we have those studies quite yet, but they are ongoing. And I've just seen things going on right now that are looking at oxytocin and testosterone and oxytocin and cortisol. So it's looking at these hormones that are supposed to be like oxytocin for bonding and for trust and augmenting these feelings. What happens, is there something blocking you when you're so stressed? Are you blocking that oxytocin receptor? These things are just underway now. I'm fascinated with it, and I keep sort of seeing more and more. I'm not always a believer of the one small study of 15 kids playing some trust game or playing whatever. I think we need a lot more research, though, before we can say conclusively.
Oops, sorry, I almost knocked over my wine glass. That would have been sad. Question about, you mentioned your kids at the end, and you showed the picture of your 4 little oxytocin
boosters.
Yeah, and I'm curious, during this time when we are apart from the people that we love, is there a way to boost our oxytocin and help ourselves with that? Sorry, other than oxy love, perhaps.
I know. Well, 3 of my 4 oxytocin humans are home with me now. So that helps. But yeah, I think right now, it's a tough time. And I actually have been thinking about this a lot with the talk, because I've been trying to be upbeat, because that's what we all need right now. But I do have to say, for most of us, like, the beginning of quarantine was like, hey, we can do this. Like, let's make a quarantini. Read that novel, get more work done. And I think we've hit this like 1 month mark. We're like, okay, we've been there and done that. We can talk about it. And now we want to move on. And I've been thinking a lot about, both from stress hormones, both from oxytocin. I do think that some of the emotional lability, like we're emotionally sort of up and down right now. I do think it makes us realize that we're not meant for social distance. Yes, we have to do it right now, and I'm not against it. And I think we have to be socially distant now. But I think doctors have known this, clinicians have known this for years, that patients, when you just reach out and touch them, when you just put your arm on someone, we know that when you put your arm around someone, it just helps their stress. We're creatures of glomming together. Most of the time when there's trauma, whether it be a global trauma, like whether we're talking about the AIDS epidemic, or whether you're talking about some not little, but a personal trauma, what's the one thing we humans do? We bond. That's what we do. And we like to have someone put their arm just on our shoulder. I think these times are very, I don't know if we can do these hormone studies now, but I do think it's affecting us in deep ways that I hope are not long lasting, because the brain is plastic, not plastic like your plastic cup, but plastic meaning the brain changes. So I like to be optimistic that some of the stuff we're going through now, we're going to rewire back to our healthy selves after it. But I do think I think in some ways, the good news is that if you're feeling off kilter, that, yeah, blame your biology, because we're not meant to be socially distant. We're not those kind of creatures. And I think in some ways you can have a little self-compassion to be, this isn't me not being tough enough. We keep saying, be resilient. And then if you feel fragile, you're thinking, oh no, I'm not resilient enough. No, we're human, and it is affecting our hormones in ways. Can we say your cortisol's here and your oxytocin's there and your serotonin's there? We don't know the exact levels, but I do think that a healthy human body has a lot to do with our outside senses affecting us inside, whether that's touch and smell, the smells of restaurants, being around crowded people. I even think it's not just touching physically, but it's the hubbub of people around us. So that was really long, rambling way to answer a question that's kind of like, I don't know. I could have answered it that way.
No, I think that's good though, because I know that I and many of my friends have talked about how difficult this time is to be separated from people. And so what I'm taking from what you're saying is that, one, that's normal. And two, perhaps we should make sure to have contact with people, even if it's virtual right now.
Yeah, I think virtual is good. It's not, and I'm realizing I need more than virtual. Like, virtual's good and this is fine, but, and we have to do what, let's just keep doing what we can do and we can get through it. But it is tough. I think we have to realize, even those of us, I like to be alone a lot, but I also like to be in a hub of people. And I think we realize that community is more than just virtual. And it's great that we have this technology, but as humans, it's not enough.
Well, I wish I was in a room with all of you folks right now, because this would be a lot more fun. But I appreciate everybody being here. And I appreciate you, Randi, for being here and joining us from 3 hours ahead and staying up late and to talk to all of these people. So thank you for being here. And we're going to wrap up now. And Randi is going to be on the chat, on the text chat. If some of you didn't get your questions answered, you're welcome to join her there. So I'm going to share my screen, and thank you, Randi.
Thank you.
And show you a couple quick more things. So next week, next Thursday, same time of 7 p.m. Pacific, we will be talking with Dr. Nicole Michael, who is an ecologist at the National Audubon Society's Science Division, talking about hope is the thing with feathers, finding joy in birds. And I think she'll be focusing primarily on the Pacific Northwest, but also talking about just bird watching in general and what you can see from your home and how to attract birds to your yard and things like that. So it's a practical way to interact with nature during this time. I encourage you to come back and join us for that, or watch it when we post it online. And then just as a final thing, I'd like to again mention that we do need your support. We do have some expenses with paying for Zoom and equipment and all sorts of things. If you are able to, we would love to get your support either through Patreon on an ongoing basis. We have several different levels. We can get a Science on Tap pint glass along with a couple other things. There's also the opportunity to do a one-time donation through our nonprofit partner, Make You Think, and those links are both up on the screen. If you also have if you want to volunteer with us, if you have some skills in terms of podcast production or anything like that, please get in touch with us. We would love to get your input on that as well. So with that, let's say thank you again to Dr. Randi Hutter Epstein, and make sure to check out our podcast of her talk. Again, that's our podcast called A Scientist Walks into a Bar, and her topic was Aroused, the History of Hormones and How They Control Just About Everything. And have a lovely evening and stay safe, and see you next week.